movement, the masses are not going to be paid for their activism, right? So if we really believe in building a mass movement, it's important to think about what is that actually going to look like. And so we all have, in some cases, many day jobs, and we're students, and we're this, and we're that, and this is something that we come together when we can. That's also part of why we identify as a feminist organization. There's the classic understandings of feminism, but also we take care of each other. We believe that we are also people who need to be treated well in our work. And there tends to be sometimes side benefits to this too. Just this time last year, we were infiltrated by 2 police officers. And it was largely because of the ways that we're really close, we really take care of each other, we really know each other, that it was pretty easy to figure out that these people weren't who they say they were. If we were sort of, I guess, less of a tight group and less sort of in touch with who we are, I don't know where that would have gone. We're anti-capitalist and anti-colonial, basically about recognizing that colonization and capitalism are both problems, and that our long-term vision is about stopping both of those forces. In the immediate, we live in this world and we try to make it less bad. And finally, part of caring for ourselves also, I think, is, like, the work we do is really depressing. It's really hard. If there are victories, they're often invisible. A victory might look like we come back to a place where we were sure a mine was right about to be developed, and we realize 5 years later, oh, there isn't one here yet. But we never get an announcement. The mining companies will never say, like, because of amazing activism and resistance, we didn't build this mine. So the victories are kind of hidden. The violence, the bad news is constant. So part of the way that we stay sane in this work is by doing things that are creative, theatrical, and humorous. Always at the expense of the mining companies, of course, as we said here. And with that, before I continue?
I think super quickly, maybe it's interesting for people that are outside the organization to know how we've reached these agreements, or like how people that are working loosely in a group base are able to come to this. And some of the things were very clear from the beginning from people who started the group, and as people join in, then we felt the need for reevaluating things and for having conversations again. So not too long ago, there was a long conversation about, like, what is our strategic plan? Do all those things fit with everyone that's involved and having the conversations and doing the work? So because of the structure of our group, I think an important part of what we do is having those conversations regularly, which I don't know how other NGOs and organizations that are funded in different ways grapple with these things, but it's like, essentially, this is what guides the work. Everyone should be on the same page about it, and it takes time and effort to have those conversations and to think strategically about the work.
So what does any of that actually look like? We'll show you some examples. So one typical miss in action is crashing shareholder season. So shareholder season is usually the spring. All of these hundreds of mining companies that are based here in Toronto, they hold what are essentially corporate meetings / parties to celebrate how fantastic they are with their shareholders, and we feel it's very important to be there to say, like, hey, what about, and I can give you some examples of how we sort of poke them. Ooh, everything is very bleached. Okay, this was just this past spring. A sort of typical action at Hud Bay Minerals, which is one company that I'm going to go into a lot more detail on later as sort of a case study, but one company that we've done a lot of work around. So what was kind of typical about this is that we brought some impacted community members from their Guatemalan mine. We supported them in coming to Toronto to go into the shareholder meeting and present directly about why what the company was saying was not factual, and frankly why they were lying about what was actually happening in Guatemala. And we also connected with communities actually next to all 4 of Hud Bay's mining projects globally. And so the campaign this year was United Against Hud Bay, because these were communities from Peru, Arizona, North Manitoba, and Guatemala that were all speaking out, and that's 100% of Hud Bay's mines represented. This was at a Varrick shareholder meeting. a little hard to see, but we constructed a literal house of cards. Each one was almost my height. And they each sort of listed different aspects of problems with Varrick's mine. So you can maybe just barely see there, it says asthma, silicosis, cancer, and I can't read each one, but that was specifically naming health impacts that have been proven through university studies at their mines. And so each card was a different impact. And the idea is that any one of these can knock down, in this case, the financial stability of Varrick. And Varrick, in our case, is a fun example because for, I think, almost 8 years now, we've been saying this is not a stable investment. I mean, that's not usually a core message, but at the shareholder meetings, that's a powerful message. This is not a stable investment. Their stock is going to come crashing down. It's based on all of these things that are essentially lies. And sure enough, 2 years ago now, I think, their stock tanked by over 300% when basically a number of these lies came out. And their flagship mining project they were hoping to start in Argentina and Chile got canceled because essentially they lied about their environmental assessment. They're now being sued in 2 class action lawsuits by their own shareholders. So we had a kind of fun, like, told you so sort of moment. This is another kind of lower key action that we do. 2 of us simply, so we own like 1 or 2 shares in a lot of these companies so that we can enter the shareholder meetings as shareholders. So myself and a colleague, we entered one of the meetings and simply shared information that, in this case, a community in Kyrgyzstan had shared with us about Centerra's mining. So just made a shareholder presentation at their meeting. This was a Goldcore annual general meeting where we wanted to specifically highlight that it had been, I believe this is when we were highlighting that it had been 5 years since someone had been, I'm mixing up what year this even was, unfortunately. Yeah, we held a memorial march marking that it was 5 years since someone had been murdered and no justice had been done in connection with one of their mining projects. And we also, it's a little hard to see, but we pasted posters, which is just like a type of natural glue that makes the posters very hard to remove, all over the financial district, posters that showed people and their statement about the impact this mining project had had on their life. And we held a memorial march and left flowers and some stickers showing the image of someone who was killed, who I'll talk about a little bit more later. What else do we do? Sometimes we put on a show. So we supported a process called the Permanent People's Tribunal against the Canadian mining industry. This was something that I think over 20 different NGOs participated in as a way of having a people's court to show what the impacts of Canadian mining were across Latin America. The verdict from that court came out just before Christmas, and we wanted it to deliver it face-to-face to the mining company so that they couldn't say what they often say is, oh, we haven't heard anything about it. We wanted to deliver it to their face. And since it was right before Christmas, we thought, wouldn't it be fun if we had about 20 of us dressed up as Santa Claus, and we delivered it to them with sacks of coal and the, you can't really read it here, but the verdict written out like really large. So this says Varrick Gold guilty. I was amazed that someone from the company sort of almost posed for us with his stocking, the coal, and the guilty sign. But that was one way that we delivered the verdicts for them. And it was a really fun action. You can't really tell, but they were singing Christmas carols of modified lyrics. Here we were also highlighting lack of justice through the courts, or in this case, that a World Bank tribunal was ongoing, in which the country of El Salvador was being sued for over $300 million by a Canadian mining company because the country had refused to permit a mine to happen, to give the permits for the mine. And I mean, I don't even almost know what to say about this. Like, it was so obviously preposterous that a company could sue a country for exerting its own sovereignty and not allowing a mining project to go through, but this was happening under certain international trade deals, and the place where the trial was taking place was in this World Bank tribunal that we really felt was a kangaroo court, which is sort of an expression for a ridiculous farce of a court. It's actually just a few corporate lawyers who are on this court and who issued the verdict. So we held our own kangaroo court with a kangaroo, a giant judge's gavel, and people sort of pleading on both sides right in front of Oceanic Gold, the company's offices. And then we delivered, I think it was a ton of signatures from around the world. I think it was over 500,000 signatures in opposition to this process directly to Industry Canada and to a number of local government officials who are part of approving these trade deals. Whew, forgot that there's more. Yeah, so we teach and engage. What example did we give? Yeah, so we try to make sure that we're not sort of repeating the same thing, that we're not stopping at just, oh my God, over 75% of mining companies are Canadian, they're causing all of these problems, but then we really challenge ourselves to look deeper, to think harder. So recently we started doing some workshops about the overlaps between mining injustice and disability justice, and that was actually about challenging ourselves and really thinking critically about how we talk about disability and illness in the communities that we work with. If we're constantly going out and saying, look how terrible it is, look at all these birth defects in this community, what image of disability are we portraying? We need to both hold the mining companies accountable, and we also need to not throw disabled folks under the bus in the process. We need to really have a nuanced way of talking about this that both conveys respect and dignity for people's bodies and life experiences, and also doesn't let the companies get away with anything. That's just one example. We've been trying to do a lot more sort of in-depth workshops recently. And last one, trying to make sure we get the words and the voices and the statements of impacted communities here and to the people who are making decisions. So one way that we did this is, so we were really deeply impacted by the death of Topacio Reynoso Pacheco, a 16-year-old youth activist in Guatemala who was murdered in association because of the resistance work that she does to Canadian company Tahoe Resources Escobal mining project. Personally, I'm a youth worker. My day job is working with 16-year-olds, and it hit me really hard, and I think we were all deeply impacted. We're in close touch with Topacio's family, and one thing that her mom said is that she not only didn't want her daughter to be forgotten, but she wanted her daughter's face to be recognized. She wanted her to basically not have died in vain and to continue to be able to be part of this struggle. So one thing that we did is we printed hundreds of stickers. They're a little bit hard to see, but they say "Rest in Power, Topacio Reynoso Pacheco," and give a little bit more information at the bottom, and they have an illustration of her face. And we did a number of things. One thing is we asked people to stick them all around Toronto, just on a subway platform somewhere. And we also sent hundreds of them back to the resistance movement in Guatemala. And we heard that a few days after they received them, they actually covered the Canadian embassy in Guatemala with these stickers. And that it was a useful symbol for them. We also here held a memorial for her I think 10 days after she was killed, where we had a small ceremony. We played, she was a poet and an artist. We were able to play some audio recordings of her poetry, and it was actually facilitated by Marco, who's sitting right here. And we were able to commemorate this loss. And we did this right outside, at Gold Corps' corporate office, to also make sure that it was clear who we were blaming for her death. Okay, so that's the general of what we do and some specifics. What I wanted to do next was to pick sort of one mine and one place and sort of walk through what this can look like what does mining injustice look like in a place, and any place is obviously only one example, but also show what does our solidarity work actually look like in any one place. So I'm going to try to do both at the same time. So this is a photo that I took in 2009 when I visited Guatemala and became very curious about Hudbay's mining project in the northeast of the country. This is a mine that it's a property that's been owned by Canadian mining companies since essentially the 60s. The initial development of this mine was like directly linked with the armed conflict and genocide that took place in Guatemala from the 60s through to the 90s. Like the history of this mine is essentially a disaster over the several decades leading up to now. There are thousands of people who have been evicted in connection with this mine. I won't get into the whole history because it's a mess, but suffice it to say that Canadian companies were very, very, very up close and center and involved in some of the worst acts of genocide in Guatemala's recent history. What I did more recently is met with members of the community, specifically Lote Ocho, which is one small community where I kind of heard people saying like, oh, I think they have a story to tell, and like, I don't know if it's been shared yet. There's tons of communities around this mine, and not all of them had spoken with someone from outside Guatemala. I ended up specifically meeting with the women of the community because I began to understand that there was some sexual violence that had taken place. You can continue. This is Rosa Elvira. This is one woman I spoke with who, as a result of, okay, so I should go back. Hudbay at one point decided that it wanted to evict the community of Lote Ocho from its land. To this day, I actually don't understand why. The area where they live is not area they intend to actually mine in any way, but technically they consider it part of their mining concession. They decided they wanted to evict the community from their land, and in the process of doing so, about a dozen women were violently raped by company security guards and the Guatemalan military, who assisted with the eviction. So she was just one woman I spoke with, and she lost a baby she was pregnant with at the time as a result of those rapes. Yes, there are a number of movies. I'm going to show a brief film right now. If you just click in the center of the... Nope. Can you go back one slide? Yeah, if you bring your mouse to the center of the screen. Yeah, if you click there. Let's see if we have some volume going on. It will be appealed. It'll be 10 years before justice is served, if ever. So one of the roles that we consider as important for us, we're not lawyers, but is to support the people who are bringing this case forward and to make sure that it's sort of used as positively as possible to bring about whatever change can happen within the justice system. I'm going to go through the rest pretty quickly because I'm excited for Monica to show her films. But other things that we have done in support of these same communities and these same people who are impacted by Hudbay's mines, Monica and I showed up actually at a fancy mining industry luncheon that was happening, I think $150 a head. And we casually replaced their pamphlets with our own. So the event was truly called Canadian Miners, The Challenge to Lead. What you can't see is that we added a title underneath. Do you remember what it said?
It says, all corporate criminals taking leadership.
Right.
For more details, visit.
Yeah, and this is a QR code that people could scan with their phones that would go directly to the video I showed earlier of Rosa Elvira giving her testimony. So that's a fun way to sort of get in their space and even at their own corporate parties to show that we're not letting you get away with this. And the reason we went to this party is that Hudbay's CEO was giving a talk about their corporate social responsibility initiatives at this event. We also have since partnered with and become friends with the Matthias Colomb Cree Nation, and in this case, that's Chief Arlen Dumas, who came down from northern Manitoba to Toronto for Hudbay's shareholder meeting to protest in solidarity with other communities impacted by Hudbay, but also to highlight the violence that is happening on their land and how the mining that is taking place on Cree land, on the territory of the Matthias Colomb Cree Nation, is happening without consent and without their permission, and that Hudbay has refused to come to the table with them in a real way and resolve this situation. And one way that we showed solidarity, so that was the Chief Chief Arlen Dumas and many members of his community who had flown down to be here outside, and inside, in solidarity with them, we used about 300 helium balloons to hold up a message that was very hard for them to take down that said Hud Bay Minerals corporate criminals in the lobby of the building, so that all the shareholders coming in and out could see that.
Where was it?
It's at the corner of like King and University. I think it's the Sun Life building. It has like wonderful high ceilings in the lobby. And this is kind of a goofy photo of Angelica and I about to go swimming in Guatemala, but just like to say that the relationships are really a key part of the work that we do, and it's by being in touch, by occasionally someone going to visit when possible, that we make sure that what we're doing here really is actually supporting what's happening on the ground there. And this is a case where Angelica and Herman, who are each part of the lawsuits that I explained earlier, received a petition that was signed by thousands of Canadians, sort of bolstering them as the criminal proceedings slowly sort of happen in Guatemala concerning the same violence. So there's criminal cases in Guatemala, and then there's the civil cases happening here. Just to show like what this looks like each year, we were not pleased with the way that the cases were proceeding in Guatemala. They essentially were not proceeding, and where they have been going forward. There's been huge issues with racism on the part of the judge against the Indigenous claimants. It's been sort of plagued by issues. The Canadian court process is also very slow, so we held our own little court outside of Hud Bay Shareholder meeting. It's hard to see, but we've got like a 15-foot puppet version of Hud Bay's CEO, David Garofalo, who testified in our little trial, of course. We have a judge and a gavel in the far right corner, and various witnesses and defendants and prosecutors. And wherever possible, we're bringing all of this information back to the community. They're looking here at the exact photo that was on the previous slide. They thought it was a really funny action, and they think we're a bunch of clowns. But I think that that's a good sign.
What is the outcome of the court case?
It'll be ongoing for many, many years. It's being fought right now.
Is the one with dirty hands, the one with Chevron, that's different slightly, is it? Or how are they, can they be used together? Because they're both international torts, right, in a Canadian court?
Yeah, since that Hud Bay case was accepted in court a few years ago, there's been a number of new cases that are also really, really interesting. One connected to another mine in Guatemala, one connected to the Canadian mining company Nevsun's operations in Eritrea. There's an interesting case against Joe Fresh as well for...
That's the building one, right?
Yeah, exactly, relating to worker deaths at their factory. And there also is sort of a ridiculously complex case against Chevron relating to oil spills in Ecuador that has bounced from Ecuadorian courts to US courts and now potentially will be in Canadian courts, where the victims have already been proved, like the Chevron has been determined guilty in various places. The question is, where is it going to actually pay? Here we held a Mayan ceremony with a Mayan spiritual guide who actually now lives in Toronto, commemorating the 5-year anniversary of Angelica Chok's husband and marking that no justice had taken place. And we've often held sort of memorial marches in association with that. Yeah, that's a sign that we covered the streets with. It says, "Rest in power, Adolfo Luis Shaman, murdered September 2009 by Hud Bay Minerals." Yeah, and just to say that when we hold these memorials, it's often at the exact same time as a version of the same is taking place in Guatemala. So here, and if you go to the next slide as well, this was a ceremony that was taking place to mark the 5-year anniversary of his death in El Astor. That brings us to, like I said, much more recent to now, when we have finally, or I should say when we have recently connected with not only communities next to Hud Bay's mine in northern Manitoba and in Guatemala, but more recently with communities in Peru next to Hudbay's Constancia mine, which I'm going to talk a tiny bit more about in a second, as well as a new mining project called the Rosemont mine, which Hudbay is pursuing in Arizona, which is being very fiercely protested there as well. This is a little bit hard to see, but I wanted to take 2 seconds to talk about the mine, the Constancia mine in Peru, because a number of things have taken place over the past few days. This is sort of the area where the mine is beginning production, and if you'll go to the next slide, this is yesterday when a over 3,000 person march took place. What has happened is that, so this project affects 3 districts, Velille, Chamaca, and Livitica, and it has been really highly contested in all of these districts in a number of different ways. There's been quite a number of conflicts since Agitate began developing the mine there in 2011. But just yesterday, community organizations in Velille have been responding to their ongoing frustration by launching a 72-hour strike against the mine. Some of their demands are to have there be joint environmental monitoring, so joint as in not only conducted by the mining company or people paid by the mining company, at least 3 times a year, for all the communities in the area to be listed as directly affected, which is important because if you're not listed as a directly affected community, according to the company, it impacts what resources and what information you're allowed to have access to. They're demanding all sorts of modifications to the environmental and social impact agreement for the mine, including that when Hudbay changes that impact agreement, that they actually get to see those changes and be reported to them. They want a contingency plan for contamination. They want the company to invest in the district development plan, which relates to their goals for education, for health, etc. And the reason they've resorted to a strike is because they have essentially been unable to dialogue with the company for a long time, including multiple requests by the mayors of all the nearby communities for meetings with Hudbay have gone unanswered. This sort of an action at this moment in time in Peru, I don't think I can overstate how dangerous this is. For the past few years, Peru has been an incredibly difficult place to be a land defender. The violence that defenders there have been subject to, often by the police who are being called by the mining companies, and also the new ways that the Peruvian laws have been changed to criminalize land defenders has been really extreme, whereas before it might have been, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but whereas before it might have been sort of a year or a few years for something like disruption of the peace or the sort of thing you might get for blocking a road have been changed to over 10-year sentences. So there's direct violence on people's bodies, and there's violence that's carried out through the justice system as well. So just to highlight what sort of a risk is being taken right now by the people living in this area to stand up for their rights. And I'll note that this is not a community, the communities in this district are not asking that the mine not exist or that the mine be shut down. The communities we work with around the world all have different demands. In this case, they want the mine to go through in a way that will benefit them, that will be safe for them, that will not contaminate their environment. Versus, for example, the Memphis Pacheco Cree Nation say there should be no mine there at all because they never gave their consent. So just to not conflate sort of the different demands.
Their type of solidarity, and this relates more to the education piece that we talked at the very beginning of the presentation. So how do we bring these stories, how do we share them around and disseminate them as much as possible? And how do we start shaping people's consciousness differently with the impact of these stories? And I'm really interested on the power of storytelling, like all the information that you received today, if you receive in the shape of a story, it'll stay with you a little bit longer. And that's what I was hoping to do with the project called Crude Gold. So because of the way that Mining and Justice Solidarity Network functions as a group, we are each able to come up with projects that we're really passionate about and gather support from our group members and tap into the network of solidarity of the group. So this is a perfect example of how that looks like. There's many other ones and more in the works so that Rachel and I are planning regarding like the power of storytelling, the power of the arts in conjunction with social change and social justice. In this example, I was really, really interested in reconnecting with my heritage. I'm from Colombia and I wanted to go back and see the privilege that we have here in Canada with the history of extractivism in other areas. I wanted to go back home and see it firsthand, and in order to do that, I created a link between MISSIN and PASS, which is an organization out of Montreal. Is the solidarity, let me think about it because I can't say in French. Sorry.
I'm looking at the soccer ball that's got all the patches, right? And I'm trying to see, as an analogy, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. I'm trying to see, with the knowledge I've got and stuff I've been involved with over the years and what you're telling us about this, is the prime mover in this the Canadian company going there, or is it the government that is the prime mover in bringing them there?
The local government?
Yeah.
In the case, I can speak to the case of Colombia. The president in power for the last 2 terms before the president right now was very pro-mining and extractivism. So not only resource extraction in terms of minerals, but also petroleum. So yes, that absolutely has something to do. Like he was always very clear about his economic model and wanting it to be shaped in a certain way. But even if, like in the case of El Salvador, even if the current government is very respectful of people's wishes, what happened in El Salvador was that they had lots of popular consultations, consultas, referendums, and overall, like the majority of the population in El Salvador participated and voted against open pit mining. And the government reflected that in their policy and decision making. So even in that moment, treaties that were signed years before will impact whether that government is able to carry out that mandate or not, or whether they have to make way for the foreign companies to come in. And so in that way, I guess, our foreign policy has shaped those things. So the way that it's shaped mining codes around the world, and recently many new ones have been created and passed, will have influence on, regardless of the political leniency of a government that comes into place in the future, because those things have already been laid out to be permissive and to be welcoming to foreign mining companies. So that's the tricky part.
And there's so many examples of Canadian government officials or Canadian mining execs like actively participating in rewriting countries' mining codes. Like it's not subtle and it's not unknown. And maybe just take this moment to, so I should have looked this up before coming here, but my understanding of the word extractivism is that it comes from extractivismo, which is the Spanish version of the word, which is itself a word that came out of social movements in Latin America, who were recognizing that this isn't really just a mining issue, and the issue is not mining. In many cases, various types of mining have been happening here for thousands of years. This is about a very particular model that is super complicated, that connects all these dots, like Monica was saying, between what might be the current government, between trade deals, international governments, the way financial power moves everywhere, and that ultimately prioritizes like it's taking of resources out of the ground for the benefit of the wealthy, often also the wealthy abroad, at the expense of people's lives, people's health, the environment, community well-being, etc. Like, I'm sure there's a better definition of extractivismo out there, but I think what's cool about that word is that it recognizes that this is a whole complex web. This isn't really about mining the same way that it also is not just about oil.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Sure, yes, thank you. Seems to me in Canada, most people, say Sydney and Toronto, and even across the country, I think, are pretty humane. And if most people were aware of these absolutely ghastly and terrible practices, that there would be an outcry and that Canadians would insist that any companies that we have dealings with, that that this is a crime against humanity, which it certainly is. And so I wanted to ask you whether you've been able to engage the media in this area, because that is very clearly what's got to happen. I know there are some really good people in the media, you know, in the Toronto Star, probably CBC, TV Ontario, and so forth. And if we could get the word around so people would realize that Canada and Canadians are really a party to all this through the mining companies, I think that would change things radically. Could you explain, you know, what you are doing, what we can do? I hope to contribute a little bit of money towards what you're doing, but it's so effective, important to wage this struggle really effectively to reach Canadians at large, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I feel like it depends on the case. The media will hook to the story or not. In the case of Hudbay, so the Chalk versus Hudbay case with Angelica, there was some media presence because it's such a precedent-setting situation. It's generally not easy to get mainstream media's attention, but we are very active in grassroots media, and I think even though it doesn't reach the same segment of population as mainstream media would, the stories do circulate, we do share information, and it takes a different shape. The ownership is different, it's shared in different ways. I think it is tricky to get the mainstream media involved and for them to be interested. There's so many stories that can be told about it, and it's in order to analyze it properly. Also, it can be perceived as very destabilizing. It needs to be. The reasons why we're against it are anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, and that's not always the story. That's not the angle that gets shared a lot in mainstream.
Yeah, to add a bit to that, I would say, so there is constantly grassroots media attention to this, and I would say there is major media almost every week somewhere in Canada. Like in the 8 or 9 years that I've been really actively organizing around this, I am hopeful. In situations several years ago, I would be in a room of people who consider themselves social justice advocates, and literally 0 people had heard about issues with Canadian mining companies. I actually think a lot has changed since then. I think it is filtering out to broader consciousness. Though I have to say, to be totally honest, my biggest nightmare situation is of getting to a place where everyone knows, oh yeah, Canadian mining companies are terrible around the world, but nothing has changed. So that's sort of my biggest nightmare, and that I think is a challenge for us as MISN to figure out how do we make sure that people aren't just finding out that this is a problem, but that we are creating many, many, many ways for things to change. In terms of how people can support with getting the word out, that's a pretty easy thing. I mean, we and the many other members of our group have 50 videos that we could screen. Some are feature-length, some are award-winning, are happy to give lectures, are happy to give talks, are happy to share materials with anyone who may want to host that kind of a thing. We are very often involved in very particular campaigns that need attention. We're part of many different networks through which we try to push for, in some cases, some more mainstream change. So we're part of a network called the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability, which is working to rewrite Canadian laws to change the amount of impunity that companies experience when they work overseas, to make it harder for them to get away with doing whatever they want. But I don't want to undermine the importance of supporting each individual community struggle as it happens, because really who is stopping this issue are the communities on the ground who are fighting back. And I think it's super important what we do to amplify their voices and to bring that truth to the companies here. But I think some of the most important things that we do are sharing information about the strike that's currently happening in Peru. We'll send a few $100s on 1 hour's notice to communities that have experienced an emergency, and we'll gladly accept your generous offer to donate to our Impacted Communities Support Fund, where 100% of the funds in that go directly to communities in emergency situations, or families or individuals who've been attacked. But I think it's about people bringing it back to their own situation. If you're part of a church, your church undoubtedly invests in the Canadian mining industry, and are there ways to start a divestment campaign? Do you have a close relationship with someone in the media? We'd love to either be connected with them, or maybe you want to connect directly with your friend and talk about how there's a story that needs to be told. Mm-hmm. Or come to one of our protests or events.
The things that you've covered most are obviously human rights violations that there's no reason at all for them to have done. You don't have to rape people, you don't have to kick them off the land, especially if you're not even going to use the land for mining. There's no logical connection, it's just horrible behavior. How much of the trouble that comes out of mining has to do with just egregious, wrong, immoral, criminal behavior? And how much of it would you say is because intrinsic in the mining operation, in the technology that has to be used given the state of knowledge now? How much of it is that you can't do mining without ruining the environment, without harming the workers, without putting people's health in jeopardy, et cetera? In my own mind, I don't know how much can you clean up mining and make it okay at best, and how much of it is inevitably something you've just got to stop doing?
I mean, it depends on the material, right? We focus a lot on gold because it's one of those examples where it's completely unnecessary. Like, except for a very small percentage, I think it's like 7 or 10% that goes into electronics, everything else is just decoration or investment, like it sits in a bank vault. So for that example, the amount of pollution that inevitably happens because it's extremely hard to extract the gold from the rock. You have to use cyanide or mercury. Then from our point of view, it's completely unnecessary. There's no reason, unless a community is choosing to go ahead with that type of economic development for themselves, and then they come up with solutions that make it environmentally friendly for themselves. There's no reason why it should be imposed on anyone. There's other things that are used more frequently in our lives that different arguments can be made for. But in general, mining is environmentally impactful in negative ways. In Colombia specifically, I'll use this example because it's the one that I'm most closely connected to. Small-scale miners are incredibly pro-mining. They identify with it, they enjoy the type of work. There's history of hundreds of centuries of people extracting gold for all sorts of purposes. And the advocacy they go through, they want to be trained in different ways and to be given and be able to connect to different technologies that would make it more environmentally friendly for themselves. But in doing that, they know that they're taking a risk, that it's not 100%, it's not completely sustainable. It never would be.
Even though they're not mining with huge open pits.
Yeah, but there's different scales of doing the work. So this is all relating to gold. Other industries I'm not as familiar with. But if you're mining at the scale that you heard the example in Segovia, that is such a different impact and such a different relationship with the land and the work that you're doing than if you have a foreign corporation start a brand new project where there used to be farmland and now there's going to be a giant hole with like dirty, awful pools of contaminated water. So it depends on the scale, depends on who's advocating for it, depends on the wants and the needs of the community and the relationship to mining.
I just want to add on to that I believe there could be mining that happens in an okay way. What we need is a totally different situation. We need a situation where mining can only happen with the active consent of the people who live where the mining site is. Right now, that's a joke. Like, right now, even getting local consultation is like highly contentious, let alone what the results of the consultation is, let alone the company respecting any of that.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that if we had a situation where communities actually had the power and the ability to freely give or not give consent to a local mining project, then I believe we'd be setting the scene for certain types of projects to go forward in ways that are responsible, where there may be some environmental impacts, but not the sort of environmental impacts that will make it impossible for locals to ever grow food there ever again. And in ways that really put them at power. That said, I think there are certain types of mining that just should never happen, and that are completely irresponsible. And I think open pit mining, which is literally the type of mining where you have a mountain, and in the case of gold, you literally grind it, the entire mountain, to powder, so that you can expose it to certain toxic chemicals to extract the microscopic amounts of gold that are in it, and then you're left with like a pile of toxic powder sludge, basically. That specific type of mining, I think there's no way to do it sustainably, and I think it's completely unnecessary, and local communities, I think, would never choose that type of mining. I think it could never be to their benefit, because their land could never be usable for them for anything else. Ever again.
And there's always the enticement of like, this will create jobs for an economy that's usually depressed. But then usually in those situations, the mining company and the people who are promoting the project very specifically pit communities against each other by offering these things, by saying, I'm gonna build like a health center, and I'm gonna add a wing to your school. And so, so like Rachel was saying, there's never a proper way to consent to a project and to assess the risks mutually and to say whether they want the project or not, unless the project is really, really advocated by the community.
There, if you remove colonialism, then they would have that money to build their own wing, because they would hire me as an engineer to help them correct it and build it, and then they would own it, I'd leave, and they could do what they like with it. So fundamentally, we've got to get rid of capitalism and colonialism, as you're saying.
I love it. I know there was a question of that.
Yeah, I'm just curious if you were, Segovia is up in the highlands, I guess, in Colombia. It's up, it's somewhat mountainous, or?
Slightly mountainous, but not fully on the mountain.
But it looked, there's torrents of water, that are being used for,
Yes.
mining. And so, like downstream, even 20, 30 miles, where there's still going to be impacts.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about community consensus around a project,
Right.
I would think that we have to kind of look at the entire watershed
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
to get consensus around any projects, because, well, water and food is more important. So I would think that watershed basin unit, as a unit of management, the watershed seems to be the most sensible.
If you look at the company websites, it really implies that the only people who are impacted are positively impacted and live within 100 meters of the mining site, whereas you ask locals who is impacted, and like you say, they identify everybody who is being impacted, which includes watersheds, which includes, a watershed is one logical way to look at it, but there's many others. In many cases, it includes the whole country, whose currency values often change in certain ways based on certain resources being extracted. The impacts obviously are much broader.
Yeah, it can also be really tricky because usually people will say the watershed is a good mark. So there was another video I would have shown where in Colombia there was an open pit mining project proposed in a very, very sensitive area, which is in the high mountainous region. It's an area called the Paramo, which serves as a sponge, and it releases water. It's incredibly fragile, and it's also filled with mineral deposits, and a Canadian company wanted to exploit it. And so what the government, there was tons of resistance, it was not allowed, they had to reformat the project, but the government really wanted, the Colombian government wants this project to go through. So what they suggested is that they were going to mark out watershed and where the border of the Paramo would be, and so everything else outside of that border would be fine to mine, and it wouldn't affect as much as this really sensitive area. But if you take time to listen to the experts and the people that understand the ecology of the mountain, you know that that limit doesn't quite exist. Everything's so interconnected that that is really impossible to mark out as an area and say that this won't be affected by what's happening in this area, right? So even though it makes so much logical sense, I understand from that example that it's even broader than the watershed that you think. And another tricky thing is that companies like Gran Colombia Gold that you saw, one of the reasonings that they'll boast about in the media and part of their public relations is they'll say, we'll bring technology that's cleaner. Local grassroots, small-scale miners are more contaminating. They'll use mercury way more. They're contaminating their own land, their own watershed. Let us do it properly. And we obviously know like all the complications and the lack of clarity and transparency that there is behind that. So there's interesting ways of looking at environmental protection.
You had a question?
Yeah, well, I was just wondering, I noticed that a lot of the activism you do in the actual like community tech you do is targeting corporations, which is obviously one of these, you're targeting the corporations who are actually, supporting these atrocities or allowing them to happen or whatever, whether or not they're actually saying the directors are actually, who are actually calling the order for those horrible things to happen with private security accounts. But I'm just wondering how much you target government. Because if you look at, I'm not as familiar with that kind of thing in Latin America, but if you look at in Canada, a lot of the reasons saying like this happened and injustices happen is because the government is allowing corporations to do it and to come in because they believe that, even though an open pit mine is devastating for the ecosystem, they're going to make a lot of money out of it, and the government is going to get a cut of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, we definitely, I would say, don't let governments off the hook. We focus a lot of our attention on the Canadian government, holding them accountable. We held a huge demo just a few months ago now outside of the really large foreign policy debate that happened just before the election, where like Harper, Trudeau, and Mulcair were all talking, to highlight that none of them were going to talk about mining. Like, it didn't matter which party was, none of them were going to raise this huge foreign policy issue. And I would argue that the largest foreign policy impact that Canada has on the world is through our mining companies, and the way that every step of the way they're so supported by our government at the local embassy level, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of our trade deals, in terms of funding, like everything. They are like best friends with the Canadian government. We don't focus as much of our efforts on targeting other countries' governments, because it's not our battle. We work really closely with people all over the world who are trying to hold their government accountable. We're having a hard enough time trying to change the Canadian government anyway. So yeah, we focus a lot on the Canadian government. We focus on Canadian mining companies, and we support people elsewhere in fighting those battles.
One more.
One more question.
Last question.
And then after that, I'm going to remind everyone about my invitation to take a photo outside before people disappear. Only those who would like to be in a photo, obviously, that we do share online so that we can share it with these communities on strike. Who would like to ask the last question? Who hasn't asked a question yet? Yes?
Not a question, but it's my understanding that in Canada, the law continues to not number these things essentially for free hand to go wherever they want, do whatever they want. So, we have to work on those, get involved.
Yeah, you're right. Within Canada, my subsurface soil rights tend to trump the rights to on the soil. It's the people and communities that actually live on soil. That's a major issue with Canadian law. One way this wasn't a Mission project, but I participated with some activists in Montreal, where I'm from, several years ago. One way we highlighted this is we actually obtained a mining exploration permit, a real one, on Mount Royal, which if you know Montreal, that's Montreal's like Central Park. And so once we obtained that permit, we held, and I was just supporting this action that was organized by people who were based in Montreal at that time, we held a large action where many of us were in sort of business suits and were having a ribbon cutting ceremony, and a number of other people were there to protest this mine. And then meanwhile, there's the thousands of other people on this beautiful sunny Saturday in Montreal who were on the mountain and were absolutely outraged that we had legitimately been given an exploration permit on this part. And I think for a lot of people it highlighted first of all, how ridiculous the permitting system is and how it shows its age. It's a very old law. Secondly, exactly how this, or not exactly, how this can feel to other communities who literally often find out through things like ribbon cutting ceremonies that there will be a mine on their treasured land. Yeah, so thanks for
Thank you.
highlighting that.